I never imagined my ex-husband's funeral would turn into my own public trial. One moment, I was standing quietly at his casket, hand resting on the wood while my son clung to me, and the next his sister Lisa's voice split the air like a whip. She killed him. Arrest her right now. Every head turned. The crowded funeral home fell into a silence so heavy it seemed to press the breath from my chest. 200 pairs of eyes bore into me, as though I'd just marched in with blood on my hands. My 8-year-old son, Colton, pressed himself against my side, trembling. This was supposed to be our final goodbye to his father, not the start of my public execution. But what no one knew was that Lisa's outburst would not end with my humiliation. Before the day was over, her lies would unravel, and the truth would strike back with a vengeance no one expected. The real story had begun 3 days earlier, in my kitchen. My phone buzzed with Helen's name, my former mother-in-law. Something in my gut knew it wasn't about birthday parties or custody schedules. Her voice, soft and too careful, broke the news. Garrett had a heart attack at work. The paramedics tried everything. He didn't make it. I stayed standing, gripping the counter, refusing to believe. Garrett, my ex-husband, the man who ran 5 miles every morning, who bragged about protein shakes and gym routines, dead. Just yesterday, he'd texted me about Colton's volcano science project, joking that it was harder than his MBA. Dead at 36. Impossible. But denial only lasts so long. Helen's final words sealed it. The funeral is Thursday. Please bring Colton. Whatever happened between you and Garrett, you're still family. I didn't feel like family. Not with Lisa. She had hated me from day one, twisting every mistake into ammunition. When Garrett cheated, she told anyone who would listen that it was because I wasn't enough. During the divorce, she called me a manipulator, even while her brother flaunted his 23-year-old trainer in my face. And now, at his funeral, she stood pointing at me like I'd pulled the trigger. She tortured him with custody battles. The stress killed him. She knew it would. She's a murderer and a child abuser. Keep her away from Colton. Gasps rippled through the room. Someone whispered, call the police. Another muttered, I always thought she was vindictive. Garrett's mother sat frozen, pale as ash. His brother Paul half rose from his chair, then sat back down, paralyzed. I should have run. Every muscle screamed at me to grab Colton and escape the sea of hostile eyes. But then my son looked up at me, his big brown eyes, his father's eyes, steady and calm. Mommy, he said, voice clear and cutting through the room, why is Aunt Lisa lying about what happened to Daddy? Silence cracked like glass. Lisa's face blanched. Because in that instant, everyone understood. Colton knew something. The truth was, my son had overheard an argument days before Garrett's death. He told me about it in fragments, whispered at night under his dinosaur comforter, where the shadows made him brave enough to share. Garrett and Lisa had fought loud, bitter, vicious. Money, betrayal, resentment. And then Lisa had threatened him, words that chilled me. You won't live long enough to cut me out of this family. I dismissed it as dramatic spite, the kind siblings fling when the pressure runs hot. But now, in front of a hushed funeral crowd, my son repeated her words, clear as bells in the still air. Lisa stammered, tried to twist it, but the damage was done. Mourners who had glared at me moments before were now whispering about her. Garrett's brother Paul finally stood tall, demanding answers. Even Helen turned on her daughter, eyes filled with horror. And me? I didn't have to say a word. Vengeance was already unfolding, not by my hand, but by truth itself. Lisa had pointed her finger at me, thinking she could bury me along with her brother. But instead, she dug her own grave in front of 200 witnesses. By the time the police were called, not for me, but for her, the funeral was no longer Garrett's alone. It had become Lisa's reckoning. And as I held Colton close, I realized revenge doesn't always require plotting or poison. Sometimes, all it takes is the courage of a child to speak the truth out loud. The officers arrived before the service was over. 2 uniformed men in dark blue stepped into the hushed room, their presence swallowing the whispers. The guests who had been pointing at me just minutes earlier now edged away from Lisa, as if guilt was contagious. She sputtered, "This is ridiculous. You can't listen to a child. He doesn't know what he heard." But Colton's small voice carried more weight than her shrieks ever could. He stood straighter than I'd ever seen him, hands clenched into fists. "I know what I heard. You said Daddy wouldn't live long enough." The room erupted, gasps, murmurs, people pulling out their phones, recording. The police didn't cuff her right there, but they escorted her out under the gaze of everyone who once believed her. It was the walk of shame, a funeral turned stage for her downfall. In the weeks that followed, whispers about Lisa grew into something louder. Old business associates came forward about shady money dealings with Garrett's accounts. A neighbor admitted to hearing their heated arguments late at night. Helen, heartbroken, reluctantly testified against her own daughter, saying she had overheard Lisa threatening Garrett more than once. It turned out Lisa had more motive than anyone imagined. Garrett had discovered she'd been siphoning money from their late parents' estate, funneling it into her own failing ventures. He was planning to cut her off completely. She couldn't let that happen. My part in all this was strangely passive. I didn't need to fight, didn't need to claw for revenge. Lisa had built her own noose, word by word, lie by lie. All I had to do was step back and let the truth tighten around her. Still, people treated me differently afterward. Neighbors who once gossiped about my divorce sent casseroles. Parents at Colton's school, who used to avoid eye contact, now sought me out with quiet apologies. It was as if Lisa's downfall had cleansed me, but it didn't feel like victory. What did feel like justice, though, was the look in her eyes during the trial. She expected me to crumble, to beg forgiveness for things I hadn't done. Instead, I sat there steady, my son beside me, and watched her story unravel piece by piece until the jury saw her for what she truly was. Revenge wasn't fire or fury this time. It was patience. It was standing still while a liar's own words buried her deeper than I ever could. And as the gavel came down, sentencing her not only to prison but to a lifetime branded by her own betrayal, I finally understood. Sometimes the cruelest revenge is letting a person destroy themselves while you keep walking forward. The trial stretched on for weeks. Every morning I walked into that courthouse with Colton's hand in mine, feeling the stares from reporters and strangers who wanted a headline. Widow accused, sister on trial. That's how they framed it. They didn't know the half of it. Lisa sat at the defense table, her once perfect posture slumped, eyes darting nervously around the room. She used to intimidate me with a single look. Now she was just a shell, trapped in the very lies she'd built. The prosecution laid it out piece by piece, the money trail, the threats, the argument overheard by neighbors, and Colton's words, repeated softly, bravely, about what his aunt had said. My son had become the quiet hero of the story. Her attorney tried everything, painting me as bitter, accusing me of coaching Colton, even dragging out Garrett's affair to distract the jury. But the evidence kept stacking, and the jury could see through her smokescreens. The day of the verdict, the courtroom was packed. Helen sat trembling in the front row, torn between the son she had buried and the daughter about to be condemned. Paul kept his arm around her shoulders, his jaw tight with anger. When the foreman stood and read guilty, a shudder ran through the room. Lisa's head dropped, her mask finally breaking. She didn't even look at me. But I looked at her. Not with triumph. Not even with pity. Just a calm, steady gaze that said everything she'd tried to destroy had survived without her. Afterward, people asked if I felt vindicated. If this was justice. The truth? Revenge doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like silence after a storm, heavy, strange, almost too quiet. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. I simply went home with my son, heated up leftover lasagna, and watched him build another Lego city on the living room floor. Because the real revenge wasn't in the courtroom, or in the headlines that painted Lisa as a greedy traitor. The real revenge was this: I still had my son. I still had our life. And she had nothing but the echo of her own words, played back to her in chains. Months later, when the world had stopped buzzing about the case, I visited Garrett's grave. Colton placed a baseball on the headstone, whispering something only he and his father would understand. I stood beside him, feeling the cool wind on my face. "Daddy knows the truth now," he said, and I believed him. As we walked back to the car, I realized Lisa had tried to make me the villain of this story. But in the end, she wrote her own downfall. And the sweetest revenge? I didn't even have to lift a finger. In the months after the verdict, people stopped looking at me like a suspect and started looking at me like a survivor. But that didn't erase the scars. The gossip, the whispers, the humiliation of being accused at a funeral, those things leave shadows. I carried myself differently now. Firmer. Less forgiving. I used to shrink from confrontation, to avoid conflict at all costs. Lisa had taught me something brutal but valuable. When someone tries to bury you, you don't dig yourself out. You let them choke on the dirt they threw. The cracks in Lisa's life only widened after prison. Stories leaked, cellmates who despised her, creditors circling like vultures, old friends who wouldn't take her calls. Every rumor found its way back to me, sometimes through Paul, sometimes through neighbors, sometimes even through Helen, who had begun visiting me quietly, almost guiltily. One evening, Helen sat at my kitchen table while Colton worked on a puzzle in the next room. She stirred her tea without drinking it, her voice small. "I failed both of you," she whispered. "I defended Lisa so many times, even when I knew she was lying. And in the end, she destroyed herself. I didn't argue. I just let the silence hang, because I wanted her to feel the weight of it. Revenge doesn't always require words. Sometimes silence is sharper. But here's the thing about revenge, it spreads. It doesn't stop with one person." Paul, who had always been the quiet brother, suddenly stepped into Garrett's old role with Colton. Baseball games, science projects, weekend visits. At first, I thought it was kindness. But then I realized it was guilt. He knew how close he'd come to standing by Lisa, to letting her lies bury me. And Helen, she clung to Colton like he was all she had left. At first, I allowed it, thinking maybe it was good for him. But one afternoon, Colton told me, "Grandma says Daddy would be alive if you hadn't fought with him." That was the final cut. The last straw. So I made a choice. I stopped answering Helen's calls. I stopped inviting Paul over. I drew a line around my son and myself like a fortress. They had let Lisa's poison drip too long, and I wasn't about to let it seep into Colton's childhood. It wasn't loud revenge. It wasn't dramatic. But it was lasting. Their punishment was absence, watching me raise Colton without them, knowing they had destroyed their chance at being family. Lisa rotted in prison. Helen and Paul withered in silence. And me? I rebuilt. Piece by piece, like Colton's Lego cities, stronger, sharper, impossible to topple once the foundation was set. Because revenge isn't always about striking back. Sometimes it's about walking away and leaving the wreckage behind, while the ones who tried to break you are forced to live with the ruins they created. And that, I realized, was the most complete revenge of all.